One of the most infamous traitors of the Second World War was William Joyce, Lord Haw Haw. He was a man who turned his back on Britain in favour of their enemies, the Nazis. Joyce for years made many radio broadcasts which were aimed to demoralise the British. But most people found it rather humorous, and the upper-class statements made by Joyce invoked laughter rather than fear. But at the end of the war, the British Army and the government wanted him arrested. He was seen as one of the most ruthless traitors and turncoats of the war, and he was someone who, for his work, was actually sentenced to death and executed. Inside of Wandsworth Prison on the 3rd of January 1946, the 39-year-old William Joyce was sent crashing through the gallows. But what is not as well known is that the body of Joyce was actually dug up years after his execution, and his coffin was exhumed from the grounds within the prison. But why was this? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. William Brooke Joyce was born on April 24, 1906 in Brooklyn, New York, to an Irish-American father, Michael Joyce, and an English mother. Though born in the United States, William was raised largely in Ireland, growing up in Galway during a period of rising nationalist fever and political violence. His father supported the British Crown, and young William absorbed this imperialist perspective. However, this early loyalty to Britain would twist into something far darker in his later years. In 1921, fearing Republican violence, the Joyce family moved to England, settling in London. William's exposure to anti-communist and anti-Semitic ideas increased during this period. After a brief stint in the British Army, from which he was discharged after lying about his age, Joyce enrolled at Birkbeck College, part of the University of London. There he studied languages and gained a reputation as a talented speaker and debater, albeit with extreme right-wing views. In the early 1930s, as the global economic crisis deepened and fears of Bolshevism spread, Joyce joined Oswald Mosley's British Union of Fascists, the BUF, which modelled itself on Mussolini's black shirts. Joyce quickly rose to become Mosley's deputy, acting as director of propaganda and even editing the movement's newspaper. His speeches were incendiary and laced with virulent anti-Semitism, and he developed a reputation as a demagogue. However, by 1937, his fanaticism became too much even for Mosley, who sought a more respectable public image for the BUF. Joyce was dismissed. Feeling embittered and betrayed, he founded his own splinter group, the National Socialist League, even more extreme in its fascist beliefs, but with only a marginal following. With the approach of the war in 1939, Joyce feared internment in Britain as a known fascist. Despite being born in the US and having no German ancestry, he managed to obtain a British passport through dubious means and fled to Germany with his wife Margaret just days before Britain declared war on the Reich. In Berlin, Joyce offered his services to the Nazi propaganda ministry under Joseph Goebbels. Fluent in English and a skilled orator, he was a valuable asset. He was soon employed by the Nazi state radio to present propaganda broadcasts to British and the wide English-speaking world. Thus was born Lord Haw Haw. Though the moniker was not initially applied to Joyce alone, the nickname was coined by journalist Jonah Barrington in the Daily Express, mocking the affected upper-class English accent used by one of the early German propagandists. The label eventually stuck to Joyce, whose nasal, drawling delivery and sarcastic tone made him the best-known voice of Nazi radio. Between 1939 and 1945, Joyce broadcast hundreds of radio shows, typically beginning with his signature phrase, "Germany calling, Germany calling." The broadcasts were intended to demoralise British listeners by exaggerating German victories, mocking the British government, and sowing doubt about the war effort. At his peak, Joyce had millions of listeners, some out of curiosity, others simply tuning in for entertainment. He used a mixture of fake news, half-truths, and psychological manipulation. Joyce ridiculed Winston Churchill, mocked British defeats, real and imagined, and spread anti-Semitic and anti-Soviet conspiracy theories. Although many British listeners saw the broadcasts as crude and even humorous, the government took them seriously enough to jam signals and warn the public. As the war turned against Germany, Joyce's broadcasts became increasingly desperate and shrill. By 1944, he was visibly deteriorating, both physically and mentally, and his rants often descended into incoherence and rage. In May 1945, as Nazi Germany collapsed, Joyce fled Berlin and went into hiding in the forests near Flensburg, close to the Danish border. On May 28, 1945, he was captured by British forces. Ironically, his arrest came when a British soldier recognised his voice when he was speaking to another fugitive. As he reached for his papers, he was shot in the leg, an injury that would dog him until his execution. Joyce was returned to Britain to face trial for treason. Though he was born in the US and held no legal claim to British nationality, the prosecution argued controversially that because he had held a British passport when he began working for Nazi Germany, he had accepted the protection of the Crown and therefore owed allegiance to it. The trial of William Joyce at the Old Bailey in September 1945 attracted huge public interest. His defiance, led by barrister Gilbert Bayfus, argued that Joyce was not a British subject and therefore could not be guilty of treason. However, the court, and later the House of Lords, ruled that by obtaining a British passport under false pretences, Joyce had entered into a legal relationship with the British Crown. The jury found him guilty of high treason, and despite public petitions and legal appeals, the sentence stood. On January 3, 1946, William Joyce was hanged at Wandsworth Prison by Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's most famous executioner. His final words were, "In death as in life, I defy those who caused this war, and I defy the powers of darkness which they represent." His wife, Margaret Joyce, who had also worked as a propagandist in Germany, was interned in the UK but later released. On the gallows, he remained a Nazi, and the carrying out of the death sentence was announced to the crowd later, which had gathered outside of the prison. After the execution had been carried out, Joyce's body was cut down from the gallows, and he was placed within a wooden coffin. Outside, in the prison courtyard and the burial yard, a grave had already been dug, and the coffin of Lord Haw Haw was placed inside of a grave. He was lying at rest alongside some of England's most infamous murderers and criminals, including other spies who had been executed. It's not thought that a grave marker was placed on his grave, but the prison officials documented where he had been buried. There were sources that claimed that quicklime was placed inside of the grave to decompose his remains quicker, but this did not happen. For 30 years, the body of William Joyce remained inside the grave in Wandsworth Prison, condemned burial yard. But following an appeal by his daughter, the remains of Joyce were actually dug up out of the grave. The prison officials dug the site of his grave, and they removed the coffin from the ground. These were then placed on board an aircraft, and the coffin was repatriated to Ireland. It was then taken to a cemetery in Bowmore, in Galway, and his daughter had asked for his remains to be buried in agreement with Joyce's final wish. And he had lived in Galway for some time. The body in Ireland was received by a priest, and a small funeral service occurred inside of the graveyard in Ireland. A mass was performed, and then a plain white coffin, a new coffin, which had been used for the remains, was lowered into a grave which had been prepared. So the corpse of one of Britain's most relentless traitors of the Second World War was actually buried twice. The grave and final resting place of William Joyce is marked by a white marble cross, and on the marker it says that "I am the resurrection, I am the life." He is buried today within the grave, and has not since been disturbed. There is still significant controversy whether William Joyce should have been executed or not, due to the fact there is debate about whether he was a British citizen or not. But he was, without a doubt, someone who tried to damage the British war effort in favour of the Nazis. But following his execution, he was then later dug up, decades later. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.